It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk today about seeing the urban forest for the trees. I developed this talk, I think, last year or the year before that, trying to look at the larger picture instead of focusing on the tree itself, but how we need to look at the landscape. But before I begin, there's a quiz. Now, no one's ever gotten this one wrong, at least from the audience point of view. What is this? Come on, a dot, there it is. See? Everybody gets it. It is the dot.
I'm a plant.
But it's a very specific dot. It has a location on the screen, it has a size, it has a color. Now, if you take that dot and you look at what's around it, you'll see an eye. And if you look at what's around that, you'll see a tiger. So I highly doubt when the artist was drawing this picture that she said, I'm going to randomly put dots down on a piece of paper, and God, I hope a tiger shows up. It was a planned action. Each dot has a specific location, a specific size, a specific color to create the image that she was looking for. Now, the same thing relates to urban forestry. When we have trees within the landscape, the question is, how do we put these trees in the landscape to create some greater vision? So each tree is an element or dot within the landscape, but overall we create this vision of what the forest is going to be. So we're trying to take in this talk a larger view of the forest from the landscape perspective. Now, the problem with urban forests, unlike drawing a tiger, is that urban forest is not a static picture, it's a motion picture. It moves and changes through time. The other problem with urban forests is that it's not just one artist drawing this picture, it's thousands of artists that are composed of the land uses of the residential landowners and the public landowners that make this picture. So the question is, if you create a vision of what you want the forest to be to the future, how do you implement that and create that vision? Because you have to deal with multiple landowners and a landscape that's changing through time. So the question is, how do we get the public involved within urban forestry management? And I argue it has to do with the perception of value. Because if people value what the resource is, they will put more management action into that value. So then the question becomes, how do you create that perception of value to the landowners to get involved to create that vision for the future? So it's integrating the social and the physical and biological together to create that vision of this urban forest, if you will, of the future. So I'll ask you this, perception of value. Because we take care of things that we value. So if I was to give you a brand new red car and you gave me $20,000, would you buy that car? Simple question. We're asking people to invest in urban forests for a certain amount of money. I'm asking you, would you buy a brand new red car? I'm telling you, it's a brand new red car, never been driven, $20,000. Yes, some people say yes. I say it depends. Some people also say, I want to know more. You're not giving me enough information. That's what I'm arguing in urban forestry. We're telling them trees are good, plant the trees. Maybe they want more information to understand, should they value this research more? So those who said yes, I'm going to give you this car. Anybody remember the Yugo? There's a reason they put Yugo dealerships at tops of hills. It's a brand new red car, never been driven. So if you got that and said, I'm paying $20,000, you feel you've been ripped off. Because it's a perception of value. It's a brand new red car. On the other side, if I gave you the Ferrari for $20,000, I'd take that deal. So the question is the urban forest a Yugo, if you're asking people to invest, or is it a Ferrari? Or is there somewhere in between? So what's the value? And it's not only absolutely what the value is, but what's the perception that people have? If they feel it's more towards the Ferrari and they're willing to invest more into it, if they feel they're dealing with a Yugo and you ask them to invest and do something about the forest, they're going to say, it's not worth it to me. So how do you give that value or that perception of value to the forest, which has value to it? So it's partly about determining the value of the forest and then getting that information to the landowners so they can make a decision. So in order to get to this step of trying to develop a plan and getting the perception, there's 5 messages I think that need to be conveyed to people in urban areas to have them instill or do an action about managing the landscape. So first of all, the first message is there are problems. If you perceive there's a problem and you perceive that forest can help solve that problem, you're working your way to adding that value and having that perception. So urban areas, because by default we put a lot of people in a confined space and put buildings and cars and people together, it creates problems. So urbanization, 54% of the world is urban right now. By 2050 we'll be at 66% urban. So this problem's not going to go away. We'll have more people on the earth. You have 2 options. You either densify, put more people in the same space you have, which then creates more density of people, or you have to move out across the landscape and consume more of the land base to house all the people. So this issue of urbanization is not going to go away, so it's going to intensify. So we were looking at this from the United States perspective, is what has been happening to urban land. Urban land is defined by the U.S. Census as 500 people per square mile. So we looked at the census data for urban land, and this is the change in urban land from, if I do this right, 1990 to 2000. And what this graph shows is this is the percent of the county that was classified as urban in 1990, and this is the growth of urban land between 1990 and 2000. What's telling on this graph is the slope. So if your county in 1990 had less than 1% urban land, it didn't grow much in urban land. If you move over to about 10% urban land in your county in 1990, it grew by about 4% new land converted from rural to urban. And as you move up to around 40 to 50%, you almost had a 9% growth rate. What's telling on this is not only the numbers, but is the slope, which means because we tend to move in this direction, we tend to accelerate our growth phase. You're moving from a slow growth from less than 1% to 2% to 4% to 8%, until you get it to around 40 to 80% urbanized. It averages around 7, and then it drops back off because you consumed all the land. It has to do with an edge effect. The more urban land you have and more infrastructure you've laid in the city systems, it's easier to develop outward, to put the roads and the infrastructure outward. So the more edge you have, and you move out a mile from that edge, the more land you consume. So that was the 1990 to 2000 trend. And then we said, okay, what happened in the 2000 to 2010 trend, because we had that recession in 2008. What do you think happened? Up, down, or about the same? About the same, yeah. Pretty much, it was pretty much a consistent pattern. We had a little bit decline of growth of counties less than 10%, a little bit of an increase in the counties that were over 10%, but a similar pattern. So what we did, we're finishing up the paper on this right now, this is new information. We took the average of the 20-year average growth, which they were pretty comparable, and said, let's project the United States forward using these growth projections by county. So this is what the country looked like in 2000. So we had 3.1% of the lower 48 states classified as urban. So what the color codes are, if you're a white county, less than 5% of your land is classified as urban. If you're the bright red, which is around Atlanta, New York, Chicago, maybe a little bit of LA, over 80% of your county is already classified as urban. And the color codes, they go from more blue to a red color as the growth increases. So this was 2000, this was 3.1%, and in 2010, we went to 3.6%. So that's where we're sitting right now as of the last census. So what we took then is that pattern from that graph I showed you just a few minutes ago and projected forward, what will our country do over the next 50 years? So I'm going to flip this through in 10-year increments so you can see what happens to the country. You can watch Michigan if you want to. So in 2010, we're at 3.6. We're projected to go 4.3 by 2020, 5.2 by 2030, 6.2 by 2040, 7.3 by 2050, and 8.6 by 2060. What's telling on the graphic there? Where's the urbanization occurring? It's occurring where we already have the urban land. We're not starting new cities in the middle of Nebraska. So the areas that are already the most urbanized are going to be even more hyper-urbanized into the future. So you can see what happened to Atlanta here. Big megalopolis, the New York City area, Florida turns red, the Chicago region. What's interesting on the growth, though, and this, I think it's the next slide, this is the actual growth over that 50-year period. So if you're in the dark browns here, greater than 25% of your county will be reclassified from rural to urban. But see what's happening around Atlanta, a little bit around Chicago, and a little bit around New York? We're getting a donut hole effect. The center of the city is already urbanized, so it can't grow much more. So we're getting this fringe effect of the urbanization spreading out across the landscape. So that's one thing this country's going to have to deal with, not only from the urban forestry perspective, in terms of having more urban land, but at the loss of rural land. So about a third of the growth occurs in forested stands nationwide, about a third in ag and a third in other. But as you move to the eastern states, obviously most of the development occurs in forested stands. So what does that mean to forest management? As we urbanize the landscape, we put more people on it. What does that mean to harvesting patterns, fragmentation, things like that are going to happen to timber harvesting, but also we have more people in the landscape in those urban areas. So overall, we're going to jump from 67.8 million acres in 2010 to about 163 million acres, if those patterns hold. I'm not saying they will. They've held for 20 years. There's a whole bunch of reasons why things might change. Florida might be underwater in 50 years, so there might not be any cities there. So that increase is greater than the size of Montana. will be about 90% urban by 2016, and Michigan's projected to jump from 6.4% to 14.3%. So that's another almost 3 million acres of urban land, and put that in perspective, Delaware is 1.2 million acres. So you're going to approximately double, or more than double the size of Delaware. That's going to convert from rural land to urban land over the next 50 years. So if you don't think that's going to be an issue, we got other issues, but this is a big one. It's a growing population and a growing consumption of resources and land-based. So what does that mean? If we put more people in the landscape, we consume more energy. A lot of energy is being consumed within urban areas because we produce roads, lights, and all sorts of things to run our utilities. And energy has its byproducts. Another one's air pollution. The world's largest single environmental health risk right now is believed to be air pollution. You can see on the map here where the mortality rates are highest, particularly around China and India. But as we urbanize more, we're going to produce more pollution because we're producing more energy. On top of that, there's a whole bunch of other issues that people don't understand. Increased temperatures, the heat island effect. We put impervious surfaces down, they absorb the radiation, re-radiate that back. As we heat the cities, what do? We then burn more energy to cool the city down, which then produces more pollution. So we're in this sort of a deathward spiral, if you will, of trying to keep ourselves cool as the urban area heats up, so we burn more energy. Changes in water flow because of impervious surfaces. The water can no longer get into the soil because we have the roads, so we channelize it through pipes, which leads to flooding. We have crowding issues, we have stress. There's a whole bunch of problems that are associated with urbanization. I think most people get this. Part of the issue of perception is, do they understand it and can they grasp it? They can grasp more people, they can grasp impacts to human health, they can grasp issues of stress. So I don't think it's going to be hard to sell people that there are problems. It's just to realize that there are those problems that do exist. So next on that is, how do trees play a role in this? If we have these problems, and these problems are going to get worse in the next 50 years or so, what's the role of trees within the cities to mitigate that problem? So I broke this into two different types of environmental benefits. I have what I call the tangible benefits, the one that I think are very easy to sell to people. They get that. They understand the impacts of trees on cooling the air. They stand in the shade of the tree in the summertime, they can sense it. It's a sensible benefit directly related to the tree when I stand in the shade or feeling the cooling breeze come off the forest. Aesthetics, people can appreciate that, and wildlife also. I think people get wildlife. The question is, if you want to perceive that value, is what are these other things that are less tangible that people need to understand about? So I broke them into about 4 different categories here. One is pretty easy to sell because it's directly to their pocketbook, which is altered building energy use. If you change the trees around the building, you change the shade on the building, you change the temperatures, you affect the energy use in the building. Typically, in the summertime, it's a reduction in energy use. In the wintertime, it can be a positive or negative energy use. So why would trees increase energy use in winter? Shading. So I ask this because we always ask it, why don't I just plant a deciduous tree? This is an issue of perception. If you plant a tree, because you'd say, basically, you want to heat the building in the wintertime, so you want the sunlight to hit the building and come in through the windows. You don't want that light and heat in the summertime because you want to cool the building down. So in the wintertime, you want as much light on the building as possible. So if I plant a deciduous tree, you think you'd let light through. The general rule of thumb is a deciduous tree in leaf blocks anywhere between 60 to 90% of the solar radiation coming through the canopy, depending on the species. Tree drops the leaves, what percent do you think is blocked? It's actually with perception of what people see. It's typically around 35% to 40%. There's still a lot of light being blocked. So that shading from those branches actually increases energy use. And the way I tell this, is anybody here a golfer? Try to hit a golf ball through a tree that's out of leaf. Same thing with light bulb. Anytime I hit in the woods, you're always hitting a branch. This is my dumb luck. But the same thing, the light has to get through that. It seems more open than it is, depending on the branch structure, but that's going to increase the energy use in the buildings. If we increase energy use or reduce energy use in buildings, generally overall there's a reduction in energy use. If you do that, you alter emissions from power plants. If I'm not burning the energy, I'm not using the energy, I'm not burning the fuels of the power plant, therefore they're not producing the pollutants, so you get a secondary benefit. Products or waste wood, we're talking a little about this today. Often urban areas have a lot of wood they have to get rid of. We estimated a 3% mortality rate. Nationwide, we have about 26 million tons of waste wood that cities have to get rid of Why not turn that into a revenue stream? Use it for, like you do here on campus, making some wood products out of it, using it for fuels, creating more jobs instead of just trying to get out of that. Other ones that people may not perceive about, this one I think is going to sell. This is actually monetary, where they can see a direct return in terms of dollars. These are ones that people can relate to. Changes in water quality, changes in air quality, ultraviolet radiation. Physiological changes, our bodies produce different chemicals when we view vegetation. We become less stressed, which has impacts on human health. This has a direct impact on human lives. Here's a question for you on UV radiation. Tree leaves block around 96% of ultraviolet radiation. This is what we're worried about in sunlight. So we want to keep that. That's why we're sunscreened, because we don't want to get sunburn and we don't want to get cataracts or cancers. So if tree leaves block 96% of ultraviolet radiation, my question to you is, if you put a tree in an open field in the middle of the day and you put your lawn chair in the shadow of that tree, what protection are you getting from ultraviolet radiation? It's important to understand this, because if you're trying to design to protect people from ultraviolet radiation, you have to know where it's coming from. Tree leaves block 96%. So do you think you're getting 96% reduction when you're sitting in the shadow of the tree? The answer is no. It's only about 50% reduction. So the question is, why is that? The tree leaves block 96% radiation. Why am I only getting 50% reduction of ultraviolet radiation in the shadow of that tree? Where's the UV coming from? Yeah, it's coming from backscatter. If you're seeing blue, if you're seeing the sky, it's not necessarily the sun, but if you're seeing the sky, you're also getting ultraviolet radiation. So that becomes important if you're trying to design, say, schoolyards to protect people from exposure. It's not just about putting the kid or the children under the shadow of that one tree. You want to expose them under a forested canopy. You're pretty well protected in a forested canopy if you're not seeing the sky. You're not as well protected if you're only under one tree. So there's differences of where this is coming from. Air quality effects. Trees remove pollution directly through the leaf surfaces, have impacts. I'll show you a little bit on that later. Environmental quality. This is my push here, at least prior to January 21st or whenever Trump took over, is that if trees impact air quality and water quality and air temperatures, they're tied to environmental regulations. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act requires cities to meet the standards for clean air and clean water. Forestry has a role into that. If you can tie the role of forestry to the regulations, you've moved forestry from a means of something that we want to do to something that's a regulated entity that has to be done because you're trying to meet the laws required by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the push is there. There is air quality has been put in the Clean Act under the voluntary and emerging measures. We're working on it for water quality. Carbon depends how this whole carbon market goes, but there are direct relationships to what the EPA is trying to do to what forestry is doing, and we need to make that bridge. There's also many other issues that trees help in terms of biodiversity, neighborhood cohesion, crime. So there's a whole bunch of benefits that if people understand the impacts on them personally and on society, they're more willing to invest into the forest and not think it's a Yugo, but start thinking, hey, maybe we have a Ferrari going on here. On the other side, we have costs that people recognize. Above the yellow line are the ones I think that people perceive because they can see that. They can see damaged sidewalks. They have to rake the leaves. They have to maintain the trees, plant. I think they understand pollen. On the lower side here, the things they may not understand. We talked about increased energy use, volatile organic VOC emissions. Anybody know what those are? See, not many people know about this. Ronald Reagan knew about it. Killer trees back in the 60s. Plants emit volatile organic compounds. You smell a pine tree, you smell a rose, you smell an orange, or chemicals that are given off, natural emissions. They volatilize at room temperature. If you put VOCs in combination with nitrogen oxide in sunlight, you get smog, ozone formation. So the question is, and the science is showing, just because trees emit VOCs doesn't mean they produce ozone. Because trees also reduce temperatures and remove ozone, the net effect is probably positive. But if you look at it just singularly, if VOCs lead to ozone and trees give off VOCs, therefore the false argument is trees must contribute to ozone. Well, they can, but they can also reduce ozone. But this is something they don't understand from the negative side. This one here is maintenance emissions, pesticide use, excess fertilization. I put that one up there because people always decouple themselves from the environment. The environment's one thing, people are separate, but we're part of this system. What we do and the management actions that we take impact the environment. If I choose to drive my automobile and use a chainsaw or a backhoe to plant the tree, I'm producing emissions in the process of trying to create the environment that's going to be more healthful. So we can't decouple ourselves because we've done studies on this too. Through time, if you use fossil fuels to maintain the forest, you will burn more carbon than that forest can hold. It depends on the rate, the length of the trees, lifespans, and things like this. But eventually, because you're constantly going in, planting the tree in urban forestry, you're driving your car there, tree lives a year, you go back, remove the tree, drive your car, plant a new one. The shorter the lifespan of the tree, and the more you're frequently going out to maintain that tree, the more you're burning carbon and putting carbon back to the atmosphere. So at some point, the forest can only hold a certain amount of carbon within the soils and the trees. You're going to burn more carbon than that forest can ever take up. So we have to account ourselves within the management cycle. So what do we know nationwide? We've done some national assessments. These are updated values as of 2014. Avoided energy use nationwide is about 5.3 billion. Air pollution removal in terms of human health impacts and avoided mortality is 5.2. Sequestration of carbon annually is about 4.7. And avoided emissions from the power plants is 2.6, which equates to 17.9 billion, or 671 per acre of cover in the lower 48 states. And again, this is only 4 that we know about. There's a whole host of others related to aesthetics and all sorts of other things, water quality that we haven't even quantified yet. And on the other side, there's also costs we need to quantify. So it is a significant resource that has value to society. We have to convey that message to the people that are managing the forest. It's not just a forester, it's multiple foresters who are residents that make decisions across the landscape. Message number 3, nature and people interact. It's not all about nature and it's not all about people. It's the interaction between the two that becomes important. Left is the tree cover map in the United States. Right is the urban and what's called community land, which are the political definitions of the cities and towns themselves. What do you notice about this? Where are most of the cities? Are they in the deserts or do they tend to be in the forests? People in forests tend to go together. About 80% of our population lives within the forested areas. Why is that? What's the common denominator? Pardon? Yeah, it's water. People need water, plants need water, so we tend to go where the forests are, partly because the forest's there, because there's a commodity, but also because there's ample water. If it wasn't ample water, such as in the plain states or in the deserts, there wouldn't be the trees also. These are the tree cover numbers as of 2005. We're just finishing the new numbers for 2014 in my office right now. So on average, tree cover in urban areas of the United States is 35%. Tree cover in rural areas is actually 34%. Urban has a slightly higher number. National average is 34, urban and rural combined. But you can see states that have the most tree cover are the ones in the eastern part of the United States that have the forested land, or the southeast also. Connecticut, about 2/3 of the urban area is occupied by canopy cover when looking from above. Michigan comes in at 24, so about 35% of the urban areas in Michigan are covered by tree canopies. As you move down, Wyoming, Montana, only about 9%. So water becomes very important in this. As you live in forested regions, you tend to have higher canopy cover because you have 2 things. You have water and you have a seed source to produce that forest. Does urbanization always decrease canopy cover? It tends to be a belief if we build cities, we tend to have to remove trees. Not always true. Why do we tend to think that? Because we're a biased country where most of our people live in the eastern United States, which is mostly forested, so where do we develop most of our land? In forests. If you develop in grassland areas, urbanization tends to increase canopy cover. The same with parts of certain deserts, because what do we do when we develop the houses in grasslands? We bring the trees with us. And what's the cost of doing so? Water. If you want to sustain those trees in the grassland areas or in the desert regions, you have to import water to grow those trees. So now you've got another environmental issue, particularly in desert regions. If you don't have enough water to sustain the people, how are you going to sustain the trees that need water? So species selection becomes very important. But in these states, in the green, we tend to have more tree cover in urban areas than we have in rural areas. What percent of city trees do you think are actually planted by humans? It's between 0 and 100. I'll give you a clue.
85%.
85. That's what I would thought. You think mostly. It's actually a lot lower. It's only about 1 in 3 trees are planted. And again, it's a perception of where you come from. Where I live, or in residential areas, about 3 and 4 trees. 75% of the trees are planted. But in the overall urban landscape, only about half of it's residential. Most of it's natural parkland. So overall, natural regeneration creates about 2 in 3 trees nationwide of the forest. 1 in 3 are planted. But it varies by where you're at. So in Los Angeles, 9 out of 10 trees are planted. Why? A drier region, heavily urbanized. As we move down to the bigger cities tend to have, as you have higher population density, you tend to have more trees being planted. And as you move to more drier areas, you tend to have more trees planted. As you move to the smaller cities, smaller population densities, more in the forested lands, only in Baltimore, less than 1 in 10 trees are planted. There's a lot of natural regeneration going on. So where you're at and size of a city is important, but also what land use. So in residential land, 3 and 4 trees are planted. You move to open space, only about 1 in 10. Cemeteries, about 1 in 10. And this is where it becomes important in terms of how nature and trees interact and how much do people have to do to create this forest and how much can we use nature to create the forest. On average, approximately, this is just really rough numbers, I think it's 38%, but about 40%, if you're a city that's in a forest, you average about 40% tree covers. Cities in grasslands average about 20% tree cover, and cities in deserts around 15%, the issue of water. Now the question is, of this 40% tree cover, or 20%, or 15%, how is that tree cover distributed? It's predominantly distributed amongst 2 land uses. It's either on the vacant spots or in the residential lands. And this shows the impact of natural regeneration. So when you're in forested stands, about 80% of your cover comes from those 2 land uses, about a 50-50 split, 43% from residential, 37% from vacant of the whole cover in the city. As you move to the grasslands, similar numbers overall, this time 74%. 54% is residential, 20% is vacant. When you go to deserts, it's 72% residential, only 2% vacant. So what's happening, we have a lot of empty spaces in all these cities, but when you have empty spaces in forested regions, you get natural regeneration. You have empty spaces in deserts, you don't get much regeneration, therefore the tree cover numbers drop, and most of the cover is coming from residential lands because that's where people live and they take care of the plants. So the reason we have all these trees in deserts are residential, managed landscapes, and commercial industrial, and somewhat institutional. Most of it's coming from people. As you move away from that, when you have more and more water, nature playing a larger role in regenerating that forest. So you don't have to plant your way out. You have to pretty much design your way out if you want to change the forest cover. So the question becomes, why don't we have more urban trees? National average is 35%. There's 3 reasons why we don't have more trees. One we talked about. If you don't have water, you're not going to get the regeneration. So why else don't we have urban trees? Why doesn't East Lansing have more urban trees than it has right now? If you want to increase canopy cover, there's a reason why it's not more. And it's mainly due to people. What are people doing that are preventing the tree cover from going higher? Pretty much all of you, if you own a home, well, compaction could do that. But more important, if you're walking on the grass, what do you do to the grass weekly or biweekly? You mow it. So any regeneration that's coming on in the grassland areas, we mow back each week or every couple weeks and wonder why we don't have more forest when we're out there mowing the forest weekly. God, I wish I had more trees, and you're out there mowing the trees back. So one of them is mowing. It's quite expensive to keep the landscape in a grassland status because of, well, you can see the cost there, $50 million to about $130 or billion per year that we pay on mowing and fertilizing our lawn. So we're choosing, in essence, de facto by using lawnmowers to reduce canopy cover. I'm not saying grass is bad, but understand you can't be arguing both sides that I want more trees, but I also want more grass. Something has to give. It has to go one way or the other. So if you want more trees, stop mowing. If you want more grass, cut the forest down that you're going to be mowing to keep that forest or that grassland status. The other is impervious surfaces, which we have to have. If you put down hardscapes for buildings or roads or sidewalks, it's very difficult for a seed to regenerate on concrete. Not that it can't happen and go through the cracks. But so on average, about 1/3 of a city is in concrete or hard surfaces, 1/3 on space for trees that we mow, and 1/3 is actually in canopy cover nationwide, depending upon where we're at for the what type of landscape you're in. All right, this is my next argument. So basically, you have to understand in the context of urban forestry where you're at. The solution in Phoenix is totally different than the solution in East Lansing because of the landscape. Partly about population density and partly about what natural environment do you have. Do you have enough water and do you have enough tree source? So your management plans are going to differ depending on where you're at. The argument here is we shouldn't have urban forestry because it's too costly. There is a cost. There's economic costs of planting and maintaining the forest, cutting trees down, pruning, repairing sidewalk damage, all sorts of things. There are costs to it. I'm saying the costs are unavoidable. So it really doesn't matter. The argument that it costs is not in the absolute sense, but in the relative sense. So what would you do if you didn't have the forests? So if you have people associated with trees, you're going to have costs. That does not mean that if you don't have trees, you don't have any costs. The costs are just shifted. So what does that mean? If I want to keep the forest out of East Lansing, where does the cost shift to? It's going to shift to constant mowing and or putting impervious surfaces down to keep the forest away. And there's cost to mowing and maintaining gray infrastructure. So basically you're shifting the burden to something else. Instead of maintaining the vegetation, which provides multiple benefits, you're shifting the burden to maintaining lawnscapes, which cost money, or maintaining gray infrastructure. Anybody see I Am Legend? The zombies, Will Smith? This is from the movie that creates what happens when the zombies take over and you don't maintain gray infrastructure. What happens? Vegetation. Nature cracks the surfaces, seeds fall in, the forest regenerates. And this is not just futuristic. It happens all the time. If you don't maintain your infrastructure, nature will rebound and put a forest and vegetation back in its place. So you either work with nature and make it more cost effective and do what you want to do to create that forest to create human health, or you work against nature and you have to constantly maintain the roads and maintain the grass structure to keep nature out. Because nature's, if you're in a forested region, trees are always going to be coming back in. It may not be what you want. It may be a pioneer species, it may be invasive plants that you don't want, but nature's going to bores a vacuum and is going to create a forest whether you like it or not. What we're trying to do, say, in urban forestry is let's be smart about it. Have the mix of grass, buildings, and trees, but let's be smart on our decisions. Try to make plans for the future that says, what do we want? What do you want East Lansing to be 30 years from now or 50 years from now? Look at it today, where you're at, make a plan as to where you want to be, and make the decisions now to create that forest to the future for the next generation. All right, last one. So if you can convey to people that they have problems, trees can help, they can work with nature in doing so, and they're going to pay no matter what. You're either going to pay for the tree or you're going to pay for the lawn. The other thing that's important is change is coming. And this is going to mess things up. Landscapes always change, and nature always changes. The question is, what are going to be the major drivers of change in the future? What's going to affect East Lansing's forest? So I'm going to ask you that question. I have my top 4 out of my top 5 here. What do you think is going to drive changes in forestry or forests in Michigan in the next 10 to 50 years? What do you think the drivers are? Invasives. Invasives? Invasive plants. That could be in a positive side. And negative on sides that they're invasive, but positive, it's going to create regeneration. May not be what we want, but it's going to create a forest. That's in my top 4. Population, that's my number 1. Climate change, number 2.
Specifically erratic climate changes.
Yeah, definitely. We'll talk about that in a second. And one other one, I looked at Deb, it's pests are my top 4. The other one I think is going to be, it doesn't have to necessarily be invasive, just the pests themselves. Yeah, they probably will be. The other one I have on my list, which is not a big issue, which may be more in the east, is fire, particularly out west, which is related to climate change, but fire is going to have drastic impacts. And you think fire is a wildland issue. There have been, I did my dissertation in Oakland, graduated in, I don't even know, 91. The year after that, they had a huge fire in the city of Oakland. And it took about 20% of the city out as the fire came through the hills. So certain landscapes, you may think, and Los Angeles has big fires too. So these fires, these wildfires are not just rural land wildfires. They can go into major urban centers and take out a lot of buildings. So my number 1, which we talked about, is development. It's coming. More and more people, more and more space that we have to put there. Number 2 is climate change, and I agree with you on this. I don't think the big issue is going to be gradual changes in temperatures increasing and changes in precipitation, whether It depends on where you're at. Southeastern or southwestern will probably be drier. Most of these will probably be wetter based on most of the climate projections. And it's not the little bit of, or not a little bit, but the increase in rain that's important overall on average, and it's not the average increase, it's the extreme events that we're going to have to deal with. The hurricanes, the long droughts, or the massive amount of rain that comes in a very short period of time that creates flooding, and how do we handle this? And particularly the hurricanes and big windstorms and ice storms that can damage the forest in a hurry. Rapid loss of canopy cover, which then filters back in the system that if you have a hurricane come through, it opens up space, what's going to happen? Then we have to deal with, opens up space for regeneration. So how do you deal with this? Because we're going to have more and more of these perturbations of the system, probably in shorter time frames, as there's more energy in the system. So climate change is going to be an issue we have to deal with. And so it's the short episodic events that are going to be important, but also the long-term changes in species. As species tend to shift as climate shifts, where do humans step in here and either help progress that along? So if you know that what is this one, paper birch? Yeah. That paper birch is tending to move up to Canada, and that is what's below here that might move up into Michigan to fill in that space. So which trees are likely to do better under future climates in Michigan? But the harder question to that is, when? If these trees live anywhere from 30 to 100 years, when do you start making that shift? If you make the shift too early and bring in plants that are less adapted now, they might not survive that well. If you do it too late, you're after the window. So it's this gradual change of species changing, and when do we start changing our planting habits? Because what is native? We have a lot of people in urban forestry say we want to plant native landscapes. So we look back to what the country was in the 1700s and 1800s, and that's the way it should be forever. Well, the fact of the matter is this is all out the window with climate change, because what's native is going to shift as the climate shifts. So trying to develop a native landscape to the 1700s, 100 years from now, you're going to fight a losing battle. So when do we make that shift, and what should that shift be to that new species composition? Insects and diseases. You can talk to Deb about many of them. Emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, there's a bunch of them that are coming in, are going to have drastic changes in the populations. And then we talked about invasive plants. Those are my top four that are going to be the drivers of change. Most of them are reducing canopy cover. Some of them, such as this, can actually increase canopy cover, but again, might not be what you want it to be. So what do we know about canopy cover change? The question is, we know change is occurring. There's forces of regeneration and tree planting going on in cities. New York City has a Million Tree campaign. We know, I just talked about regeneration. You also have things that kill trees, insects and diseases, development. The question is, do you think urban tree cover in our country is going up or going down? That's the question we asked. And that's what we're trying to figure out. Any guesses? 50-50 chance. It's not, I guarantee it's not the same.
It's going down.
It has gone down. And we did a study. I'll show you this study, and I'll tell you some new results that we just finished a change analysis for the whole United States. What we looked at is we took paired imagery for 20 different cities and looked at the exact same point. I think we took between 2,000 to 5,000 points at random and followed those points in a 5-year period, approximately a 5-year period, and looked at the point of what it was and what it is in the next year to try and to statistically look at change. So we looked at these 20 cities. So you can see the city. Albuquerque, the first year was 2006, and we got imagery in 2009, all the way across Tacoma. So this is the first year, the numbers, and here's what happened. 17 of the 20 cities we analyzed had a statistically significant decline in canopy cover in that approximately 4 to 5 year period. 2 had no statistical change, even though it dropped, it wasn't statistically significant, and 1 had an increase, and that's Syracuse, New York, where I'm from. Thank you. I'm out at night planting trees, keeping it busy. And that's not necessarily a good thing what's going on in Syracuse. I'll explain that in a minute, but that's the only one that actually went up in the period of time for the 20 cities. We looked at 2 cities specifically. Detroit, we were trying to look at emerald ash borer. So we tried to look just before the infestation and during the infestation. The loss in Detroit was actually lower than the average loss of the other cities, which our thought is on this, we're getting regeneration coming in. Because this is not always, in change analysis, we're looking at how many times trees go from non-tree to tree, but also from tree to non-tree. So even though you're losing ash, something's coming back in to offset that loss.
They're not taking them down.
Or, well, if they're not taking them down, if they lost the canopy and they're dead, they wouldn't be in the canopy analysis.
Okay.
but if they are taking them down, but I think we're getting regeneration, because if the economy's bad, and that's what happened in Syracuse, we have a bad economy and we had open space, you get regeneration.
Does that result relate to the de-urbanization of Detroit?
It could be, so, because we only looked within the political boundaries of Detroit. So if Detroit de-urbanized and created open space, you'd get regeneration coming back in. So the spaces that was grass would convert to trees if you weren't mowing it and people stopped. So we're getting that. We were trying to see what the ash impact was, hoping we could detect it. But we think there was an offsetting from other sources coming back in.
My question is about dead trees, because currently Detroit has about 20,000 dead trees, hazard trees, or considered hazard trees. So when you're looking at this, you can't tell maybe from your imagery if this is a dead tree or not, or if the tree that you're looking at was alive in the first measurement and it was dead.
If you do it in in-leaf photography, you can tell. If you go out-of-leaf photography, we can't tell. So we did in-leaf photography. So a dead tree, even if a tree is partial dead, it could be half canopied and half not canopied. We're only looking where there were actually leaves on the canopy. So it's not canopy space that's devoid of leaves, that's canopy space with leaves. So dead trees, even you would see it on the image, but it would be classified as not a canopy cover, even though there would be a tree there. See the difference? We couldn't do it with out-of-leaf photography because you couldn't tell. They'd all look dead to us.
Do you have a specific like height or age or what's considered canopy?
We talked about it in the lecture earlier today. That's a tough one because you, especially with photo interpretation, if you set a height class, we wouldn't know the height class because we can't interpret the height class. So it's anything that had a non-herbaceous structure. So you'd pick up smaller shrubs in this also. So when we photo interpret, it's very difficult to tell tree from shrub. So we call it tree/shrub. That's what we call it in the paper. But we can differentiate from herbaceous. The other city we were looking at is New Orleans. So what's that impact? They lost a third of their canopy cover. Katrina. We were trying to see what Katrina's effect was. That was huge. We did this with New York also after Superstorm Sandy came through. And they wanted to do it right away. And we said, well, here's how you do it. The problem with doing it right after the storm is the trees are still there. So they might be in the phase of dying or knocked over. So they did it like right after the storm, and they found no loss, no statistical loss of canopy cover. But they did it too soon. It takes time for trees to be removed from the system after you clean up the debris. You just can't shoot right after the storm. In our case, what did we do? We did it 4 years after. So some of that's not all Katrina. It's a mix of other things. But that major dominant loss is because of Katrina. What happened in Syracuse is we had a tornado that came through late 1990s, I think 1998, on Labor Day. It was a sideways tornado called the Draco, and it took out a lot of trees in the city. Syracuse economy is terrible. So what happens? If you open this space up and you don't have any development going on, what do you get? You get regeneration. And our forest is shifting from a predominantly maple forest to the big thing that took over was buckthorn, European buckthorn, which is an invasive plant. We're getting ailanthus. We're getting box elder. We're getting sumac. What are some of the other ones? Help me from the lecture today. You were there. Black locust is coming in. So a lot of the pioneer species, not necessarily invasive, but we're getting a shift to the pioneer/invasive category that because the space is open, what's going to seed in? We have water, we have plants, the seed source, you're getting a forest regenerating. Will it stay that way forever? I say no. The economy heats up. A lot of the buckthorn stands are in vacant fields that just keep growing outward. As soon as someone wants that piece of land, what are they going to do? They're going to take that buckthorn out. So it's a dynamic system. Overall, we estimate between 2004 and 2009, about 20,000 acres per year or 4 million trees per year. We just finished an analysis from 2009 to 2014, and what was the number? It's much higher. We did state by state. We put 1,000 points in each urban area of every state, so all 50 states, and followed it from approximately a 5-year period. Half of the states had a statistically significant decline in canopy cover. The other half pretty much had a decline, but it wasn't statistically significant. It was in the right trend, but we didn't have enough data to pick up the statistical. So pretty much, I think out of the 50 states, about 45 had a loss in canopy cover. 2 or so had no change at all, and 2 had a slight gain. It was like Wyoming and the Dakotas, where there aren't many trees. They had a slight gain, but statistically, most of them are dropping. And this number overall, it goes up like 7-fold. So the period, this was the smaller, this only had like 1,000 points nationwide. Now we have 50,000 points nationwide, state by state. The number's much higher from 2009 to 2014. So we're still in that downward trend. Doesn't mean we're going to stay there, because it should rebound eventually. You're either going to go to 0, or you're going to get some canopy cover coming back, but we're still in that downward spiral. So lastly, just a couple slides here. I'll throw this in as a commercial. I work mainly on iTree. It's a free tool. So a lot of the numbers that we got on canopy interpretation and the field data, what I do in my office is we collect field data with a lot of other collaborators, getting data on the forest so we can assess the ecosystem services, then we combine it with satellite data and cover data to try to do national assessments. So we work from the local scale to the national scale. In the process of doing this, we built this system that's free that allows people, you can, if you go to iTree/MyTree, there's a phone app where you can just, we're trying to engage school kids and homeowners. So there's sets of tools that are out there, and I offer this to you. It's your tax dollars paid for it. It's free for you to use now, but it wasn't free to build. There's a series of tools that help with satellite analysis, satellite data, photo interpretation. If you want to analyze one tree in your yard, you can go to design. If you want to analyze the whole forest, you might use iTree Eco. But these tools are out there. So I just wanted to introduce you to that if you want to check that website out. And if you have any questions or comments on that, you can always send it to us. But what we're trying to do is help people assess current and future benefits, but we're trying to get at this. What's the optimal design that you want to have to create sustainable management? The question we're trying to get at iTree is if I can only plant one tree in East Lansing, what would it be and where should it be located? If I can answer that question, I can then say what would be the second tree I would plant. But the answer to that question depends on what context you want to know about. So you might say in East Lansing, it's up to the local user. I might be most concerned about water flows, so I might want to plant in riparian zone. So that would be the number one zone. So we don't know what each local area wants to design about, but the design becomes different depending on what question you're trying to solve. So we're trying to get to that question of getting the best species and best locations to optimize, and it's always about the next generation. We can quantify today, but the actions today have huge influence on the next generation that's going to live in this city. So we always encourage people to think ahead and not just worry about what the current cover is, but how you're going to make that cover to a future state. It could be less trees. We're not saying it has to be more trees, but at least think about it. Take some informed information, make a decision. Do you like the way it is in East Lansing and you want it to be static? Then that's your goal. But if you don't even discuss it, and you don't get back to this perception of value and get people engaged in this discussion about what they want the future of East Lansing to be, it's always going to be the same old thing where it's going around in circles. If you want to make it better, you have to understand and get the people involved because they control over half of the land base, and get them to understand, again, is it a Yugo? Is it a Ferrari? What do they want it to be? Do you want to build a Ferrari? How do you do that? What trees should you be planting? So hopefully this tool will help do that. And what we say about this is the other thing that's important about iTree, and we don't do this. iTree is basically a calculator. It's what people do with it at the end that's important. If you take the data and do nothing with it, don't even bother taking the data because you're just wasting your money. But people have done really innovative things. This, I think, was Minnesota and then Chicago. They started putting price tags on trees to get to, and outside the state capital. So when the legislature went into session, we said don't discount the value of trees. Milwaukee did a billboard campaign about the results from the study. People go to public meetings. This is our poster child for one of the best ones, Oakville, Canada, where they institutionalized forestry more across all departments. And they won some national awards. So most of Canada wanted to do iTree just because they were very innovative. These are not our ideas. We just provide information. It's the innovation. And what we say is if you're going to collect the data, do something with it at the end. Just don't let it sit there. Make a change of something for the better. So trees can provide significant value to society, and the idea is we have to understand and communicate that. That's the key part. Is getting urban forest is not just you and me, it's everybody combined, and how do you get that information out to the general public to make a better decision for forests in the future. So that is my seeing the urban forest for the trees.